Namaskar and welcome to StudyIQ. I am your friend Rahul Saigaonkar. Let's continue our discussion of NCERT Science series. You already know we are discussing NCERT Science textbook for class 10, where we are carrying out the discussion of each and every chapter. Today's agenda is to discuss chapter 8, how do organisms reproduce. Before this, from chapter 1 to chapter 5, we have understood some aspects connected to chemistry from 10th NCERT. Then we discussed about life processes. We understood some important life processes that are required for survival and metabolism. And in our latest interaction, we understood about control and coordination. That means how do animals maintain their control and coordinate their movement. We understood about the nervous system. We also discussed how plants also have some sort of control and coordination mechanisms, although they seem like they are stationary, but they have some mechanism, some response to stimulus, as well as some sort of phytochemicals which help them in their growth and in their movement, limited movement, whatever they have, right? So today's interaction is about how do organisms reproduce. Our agenda here would be to understand about asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction as well. I remember during our school days, whenever there was a discussion on the topic of reproduction, there was a lot of shyness, confusion, excitement among students, and somehow the tutors also used to finish off the chapter very, very quickly so that they do not make the students uncomfortable, right? But I feel that this is a very important discussion, not just from academic perspective, but even from the perspective of sex education in our country, right? So pay attention to this discussion. Right, let's begin our interaction. But before that, do remember that StudyIQ is offering Prelims to Interview initiative to UPSC Civil Services aspirants. It's a comprehensive program where we will be handholding you through prelims, through mains, through interview. This entire program has been designed at a very affordable range. It includes prelims test series. It includes mains residential program where you would be called to StudyIQ Center without any extra cost for your mains preparation. It also includes mock interviews. So the whole shebang, the whole program, it comes at this particular price. Remember, admissions are closing on 31st of July. So do it before that. I'll see you in the class. Right, let's discuss about how do organisms reproduce. Before this, we spoke about life process. We said that there are certain life processes like breathing, like respiration, like eating food. Nutrition is very important for us. Transportation system in our body. Blood carries all the nutrients, the waste material, the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide through it, hormones. So we saw all those things. So there was a mention of reproduction also there. But what I feel from a technical perspective, reproduction is not a mandatory or a compulsory life process. Especially again for humans, yes, is reproduction really mandatory? Some people like to live celibate life, right? So the question is, reproduction, is it really a life process? In fact, you speak about other processes. They generate energy for you, they help in coordination, they in movement, but in reproduction there is a lot of energy which is lost. But despite that, why organisms reproduce? Have you ever thought of this? The answer to this is to leave that legacy, to continue your genetic lineage, to transfer your inheritance, to transfer your genes. Without reproduction, there would be no population on earth for any organisms, right? For unicellular or for humans or for animals, for that matter, plants, anything. Without reproduction, there would be no population on earth. We wouldn't call earth as biosphere. So that's why, although strictly speaking it's not really important again for humans, but for animals it is needed for their survival, right? So reproduction also becomes a kind of a life process. So when we talk about reproduction, there are two kinds of reproductive processes that organisms follow. One is asexual reproduction. Please remember, when I say asexual reproduction, the plain and simple definition for this to remember is there are no gametes involved. This is just the simplest definition of asexual reproduction. There are no sex cells involved, there are no gametes involved. Without the involvement of gametes, without the involvement of sex cells, if there is a reproduction, it is called asexual reproduction. That means, what is sexual reproduction? Where there are gametes, where there are sex cells. That's the basic definition. Now, what are the types of asexual reproduction and where do we find them? asexual reproduction is generally found in unicellular organisms. Generally, I told generally. Now, examples of that, the first one is binary fission. By the name itself, you do know binary. That means one cell divides into two. Fission means breaking. A cell breaks, or one cell leads to formation of two daughter cells. Binary fission is observed typically in unicellular organisms. In most of the prokaryotes, that means in most of the bacteria, we find binary fission. Examples, again, other examples are amoeba. In amoeba, we find binary fission. From one cell, it divides into two. In your leishmania, one cell divides into two, binary fission. Now, in this binary fission, you do understand that the daughter cells are exact replica of the parent. Exact replica. Phenotypically also, and remember, genetically also. Genetically also, whatever DNA was present here, exactly the same kind of DNA, exactly same kind of chromosomes are present here as well. So, genetically, the exact replica is formed here. Now, the question is, sir, when do these processes happen? For example, when asexual reproduction happens, that is a question that comes in aspirants' mind sometimes. See, that information is again in the specified DNA of this cell, and that information is dependent on the favorable conditions that cell achieves. For example, for a bacteria, when do they divide? When do they undergo binary fission? At the max, right? That means maximum reproduction happens when there are certain favorable conditions. For example, for a bacteria, it needs warm temperatures. That's why you see during the summer season, microbial activity is more, or during the warm season, microbial activity is more. For instance, in tropical areas, more diseases; in the colder areas, lesser diseases, because of the activity. Temperature is one controlling factor. Apart from that, moisture, water is needed. Yes, they need nutrition. That's why they need proteins, they need nutrition. That's why they are decomposers. Many bacteria and many fungi, uh, they are decomposers. They need nutritive medium where they can undergo reproduction. And another important factor for a bacteria is also the pH, the acidity or basicity of that medium. And a bacteria, it needs basic to neutral kind of pH, where along with the temperature, moisture, nutrients, it leads to binary fission, more and more binary fission, right? So one of the methods is binary fission. Another method is fragmentation. By the name itself, it suggests fragmentation, meaning a single parent breaks into two fragments. Now here also you will see exact replica. The DNA would be exactly same. The genetic information would be exactly same. Then again, these two can create more fragments as well. It's not necessary just like this. It's not exactly binary fragmentation many times, but remember that fragmentation means a small piece of this particular organism, it cuts off, or it leaves its parent body, and it becomes the other organism. All right, fragmentation is predominantly seen in organisms, multicellular organisms, mainly multicellular organisms, example being Spirogyra. It can also be present in some unicellular organisms as well. Apart from fragmentation, there is one more method of asexual reproduction, that is regeneration. Now, this is very interesting. Please remember, fragmentation and regeneration, they are not same. Fragmentation means any kind of fragment from the parent, it is capable of surviving on its own. But regeneration means if you simply cut this organism, this happens in organisms like planaria. Now, if you make fragments out of this planaria, please remember, fragmentation means now this is capable of surviving on its own, but regeneration means this, it regenerates again into the entire organism. Now you will see same exact copy of the DNA. Regeneration, fragmentation, there is a small difference that in regeneration, the entire organism, it regenerates. We see some sort of regenerative mechanism in multicellular organisms also. Say, for example, in our day-to-day life, we have seen lizards. You've seen lizards. Now, if you cut off the tail of a lizard, it is capable of regenerating the tail. All right. Now, apart from that, there is another method of budding. Now, budding is seen in many fungi. Budding is seen in Hydra as well. Budding means this parent organism. Let's take example of Hydra. This parent Hydra, once favorable conditions are reached, slowly and steadily a bud develops. and this bud eventually develops into the daughter organism, or new hydra is formed. Once it matures, it detaches, and you will see another one. Please remember, it's not binary fission. One has created another bud. It can happen in such a way that multiple buds can also be formed. In many fungi, we see budding as a method where multiple fungi are formed, and when they detach, multiple fungus will be produced. That is budding. Now, apart from budding, there is vegetative propagation. Now, this is predominantly seen in plants. This is predominantly seen in plants, vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation, an example of this can be grafting that we do in our basic gardening. A rose plant, you have a rose plant, you cut a branch or a stem of rose plant, and then you plant that again in another medium at new place, it will grow. We can see such things in bryophyllum as well. In bryophyllum, a simple leaf which falls on the ground, it is capable of producing multiple saplings like this, right? Through slowly and steadily, you can see another entity being grown here. And the same concept we do use in something called as tissue culture. Now, in our future subsequent classes, we'll talk about genetically modified crops. When we talk about genetically modified crops, we see that a new gene is inserted into a cell, a plant cell, and that plant cell is cultured. That plant cell becomes a tissue, the tissue is cultured, and then we can get a new sapling or a new plant itself. In tissue culture, new plants are grown by removing a tissue or even separating a cell and putting them in an artificial medium where we provide them necessary nutrients. And in that nutrient medium, it grows, it divides and it grows. This is called tissue culture. Now, apart from this, we also have one more method of asexual reproduction called as spore formation. Asexual reproduction through spores. Now, this is predominantly seen in fungi. This is seen in fungi, the fungi Rhizopus. This is also seen in different fungus. Now, what happens in a fungus when it grows, when it matures? It grows sporangium. And this sporangium, when it bursts, it leaves spores. And once this spore, it touches the moist surface, or I would say if it touches the soil, another fungus is grown. All right. Now, you should not get confused here with the idea of pollen grains. Now, you must be thinking, sir, this is very similar to pollen grains. This same thing happens in plants as well. The pollen grain, when it falls on the stigma, pollination occurs and a new plant comes. But here, please try to understand, this is not like the pollen grain. Remember, say imagine if a pollen grain, it falls on the ground, will it lead to a new plant? The answer would be no. Why? Because pollen grain will have half the chromosomes. But here, this spore is capable, once the spore, it falls on the moist surface or soil, it is capable of producing another fungus. But please remember, these spores are haploid or diploid. It depends on the plant. It depends on the fungus or organism. It's not exactly like pollen. In some funguses, there is some sort of sexual reproduction based on these spores itself. The male spore and the female spore, they combine to form a zygospore, and a zygosperm would be a diploid fungus. Some examples of spore-based sexual reproduction found in few funguses, few funguses or few fungi. Funguses would be wrong. Again, grammatically, it would be fungi, not fungus, fungi. All right, right. I hope it's clear. Spore formation between spore and pollen grain, the difference is quite clear. Right. Let's move now to sexual reproduction. This should be sexual, right? Not asexual. This should be sexual reproduction. A small mistake, right? Sexual reproduction. As I told you, sexual reproduction, again, simply there is involvement of the gametes, meaning the male gamete, it joins the female gamete, and it leads to formation of something called as a zygote. And this zygote slowly and steadily grows. That's the idea of sexual reproduction. Now, first, let's talk about sexual reproduction in plants. What kind of sexual reproduction do we find in plants? What are the reproductive organs? See, you must have seen a flower. A flower is nothing but the reproductive part of the plant. And a flower contains both the reproductive parts, both the reproductive organs. That means the male part and the female part. This is a typical flower that we see. In this typical flower, there are petals, and you see that petals are quite colorful. Petals are quite colorful. You also have sepals at the bottom. Now, these sepals are protection. You must have seen that before the flower blossoms, there is a green covering over it. Why? Because the flower, it has to be protected, right? That's why the sepals are there. Once the flower blooms, the sepals go down and the petals come out. And among those petals, you will find the androecium and gynecium. Androecium is the male part or the male reproductive part in a flower, and gynecium is a female reproductive part in a flower. All right. Now, please remember one more term. There is a term called as estivation. Sometimes an MCQ can be created on this. Estivation. Estivation is the mode of arrangement of the petals. Many a times you must have seen there are some flowers which have only 4 petals. There are some flowers which have 6 petals, 8 petals. So the petal arrangement, it is called as estivation. Now, what happens? What happens? As I told you, the male and the female part are already present in the flower. What happens? The male part, it is called androecium. Androecium consists of stamen. Stamen. Now, you must have seen in a flower stamen like this, it has a filament and it has anther. When the flower blooms, when the plant matures, it starts flowering, and in this anther there are pollen grains. This produces pollen grains. Now, we already know that plants, more or less, they remain stationary. The question now is, this pollen has to reach where? This pollen has to reach to the female part. The female part is called gynecium, and gynecium consists of 4 parts: stigma, style, ovary, and ovule. Stigma is the topmost part which receives the pollen. This receives the pollen. And style, it allows only a certain kind of pollen to fertilize the ovule. Ovary, ovary is a part which after maturation develops into a fruit, and inside that ovary are ovules. Inside that ovary are ovules. Now, ovules can be considered as eggs. These are female part, eggs. And once a pollen reaches here, the pollen fertilizes the ovule and it creates the seed inside. That's why when you see a fruit, that fruit is nothing but the ovary, and inside there are seeds. Those seeds are fertilized by pollen. So what happens? What happens? Now, pollen has to reach here. Now, please understand, pollen has to reach here. Now, plant cannot move, but still the pollen will reach. How? It can reach by wind, it can reach by water. Many a times humans, when we move, we also facilitate pollination. The major pollinators are insects. Now, what happens? There is a bee. Imagine there is a bee. Now, there is this filament, there is anther, and this anther has small pollen. Now, please remember, this pollen has half number of chromosomes here, right? It has half number of chromosomes. And when this pollen, it reaches stigma, how does it reach? Say this insect. Now, if from a same flower the pollen reaches the same stigma, it is called as self-pollination. It is called as self-pollination. Self-pollination. But if the pollen from one flower, it reaches the pollen of other flower by any kind of medium, say insects, it is called as cross-pollination. It is called as cross-pollination. Clear? Now, once pollination occurs, what happens? The pollen, it reaches, and the pollen slowly and steadily, it reaches the ovules and then it fertilizes. This ovule is also haploid, but once pollen fertilizes, it leads to formation of diploid seeds, which will help in movement of those genes forward. Clear? Now, there can be one doubt in your head, right? One doubt. You must be thinking, that's what happens. Say, imagine this is a rose flower, and imagine this is a marigold flower, and this bee, it brings pollens from a rose to marigold. Will pollination occur? No, pollination will not occur, right? That is why the job of this style is to ensure only correct pollen. That style, it basically is like a filtering mechanism. It does not allow other pollen to pollinate other flowers. All right. So this is how reproduction takes place in plants. Right. Apart from that, human reproduction system, in males and females, different reproductive parts are there, different reproductive organs are there. Again, from here you do understand, gamete from male, it has to reach the gamete from the female, and both have to combine, leading to formation of zygote. Now, male reproductive system, it consists of testes or testicles, which are responsible for production of sperms. Female reproductive system, it consists of ovaries, which is responsible for production of ovum or egg. And sperm from male, it has to meet ovum from female for fertilization to take place. So human reproductive process can be understood through these concepts. The idea of gametogenesis takes place first, then there is process of insemination, then fertilization, then blastocyst implantation and gestation. Let's try to understand these one by one. The first process is gametogenesis. Now, what is the meaning of gametogenesis? At an appropriate age in males and in females, that means in boys and girls, the pituitary gland, it releases specific hormones which activates the sex organs in males and females. In boys, it will be testes. In females, those are ovaries. So the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone, when they are activated, then the puberty starts. And at puberty, you must have seen there are characteristics which appear in boys and girls. This we have discussed before also. The secondary characteristics in boys, mustache appears, beard appears, suddenly the muscle growth increases, voice becomes hoarse, and the testes, they start producing sperms. And this process is called gametogenesis or spermatogenesis in males. In males, spermatogenia or the spermatocyte, it undergoes the process of meiosis, and one spermatocyte, it leads to creation of four sperms. Four sperms, right? Now, please remember, the initial spermatocyte, it will have 46 chromosomes, but after undergoing the meiosis process, each sperm will have 23 chromosomes. In our subsequent discussion, we'll understand the determination of sex as well. Why a female child is born, a male child is born, and what does it depend on? We'll talk about that in a subsequent discussion. But in males, spermatogenesis takes place, sperms are produced. And in females, at the age of puberty, the oogenesis starts. And a primary oocyte, after the meiotic division, it leads to creation of a single ovum or a single egg. And along with this ovum, there are three polar bodies which are produced, which are rather useless. That means every menstrual cycle, an ovum is released. That's why it is said in the ovaries at the birth itself, there are about 4,000 eggs. Slowly and steadily, these eggs are released one by one after puberty. Clear? Right. So what has happened? Gametogenesis has happened. Now, after gametogenesis, you need insemination. Now, for insemination, there has to be some sort of sexual activity. That means during the sexual activity, the male sperms are transferred into female body, and in the female body, slowly and steadily, sperms compete, and one of the sperms, it reaches the egg. It leads to fertilization. So insemination can be natural through sexual activity, or these days artificial insemination is also followed. You must have heard about the in vitro fertilization, test tube babies, etc. So artificial insemination has also been developed these days, right? So sperm, it reaches the ovum. Now once one sperm reaches the ovum, then the ovum, it develops some sort of a protective layer outside it. The other sperms cannot fertilize it because it's already fertilized. And once it is fertilized, it leads to creation of zygote. And this zygote now starts to undergo cell division. So after a few days, the cells multiply and they are arranged as blastocysts, something like this. They are arranged along the circumference, the outer circumference, like this, blastocyst. And this blastocyst, it will implant itself in the uterus. This is called as implantation. And once blastocyst attaches to the uterus in the female body, it leads to pregnancy. And once pregnancy begins, then the gestation period, that means development of fetus, it takes 9 months in humans. It's called gestation period. In humans, it is about 9 months. In elephants, it is about 22 months. For other animals, it has lesser time period also. Now, during this gestation period, through the mother, the infant slowly and steadily develops. And after 9 months, when it is time, some sort of neuroendocrine mechanism runs and oxytocin is released, which leads to contraction in the female uterus, which leads to contraction in female body. Then you will see the delivery of the baby, and the process is called parturition. After the delivery, the mother and the child or the fetus, they are attached by umbilical cord, which is cut. Later on, the umbilical cord as well as the placenta, they are released or expelled out of female body. Once the baby is born, the baby is continuously fed for the first 6 months with the mother's milk only, because the mother milk, it contains colostrum, which has several antibodies which builds the immune system of the child. Apart from that, once parturition occurs, then the oxytocin, it also activates the mammary glands in the female, so that milk production starts, so that milk can be provided to the child. Now this is the process of reproduction in humans. Now you have a question, sir, what happens if no sperm reaches, or if there is no sexual activity, or if the sperm is not able to fertilize the egg? Then what happens? See, as I told you, the fertilization has to occur. For fertilization has to occur, there has to be sexual activity. If there is no sexual activity, the sperm has not reached the ovum. Even if there is sexual activity, if the sperm is not able to fertilize the egg, then what happens? See, what happens every menstrual cycle in a female body, they have a menstrual cycle. As I told you, the ovary at birth, it has about 4,000 eggs, and slowly and steadily after puberty, one egg is released every menstrual cycle. So once the egg is released, the uterus, it is waiting that the egg would be fertilized, and implantation will take place. So once the egg is released, the uterus in the female body, it develops endometrial layer. Why? Because it is preparing for a possible blastocyst, and to attach that possible blastocyst, there is a special layer which is developed inside the uterus. But if the fertilized egg does not reach here, then what happens? If the fertilized egg does not reach, this endometrial layer is slowly and steadily left out, and that is why you see the menstrual cycle or menstruation in female body. That means if pregnancy occurs, then there would be no menstruation during gestation period, and after that for some period. That's the common understanding. Clear? That's the basic idea. I hope it's clear now, right? Now, apart from this, we also need to know that reproductive health is extremely important. That's why I started this discussion with the concept of sexual education as well. Sexual education is very important, especially among adolescents. There are so many questions, there are so many doubts, so many confusion regarding pregnancy, how pregnancy occurs, what exactly is the meaning of pregnancy, what is menstrual cycle, what is menstruation, right? Please have an open conversation about this. There has to be no taboo connected to this space, right? So you do understand that to avoid pregnancy, even if there is some sort of sexual activity, to avoid pregnancy, there are many measures. That's why these days there is a movement that children have to be by choice, not by chance, not just by sexual activity. Now, in humans and in some animals, sexual activity is also performed as a means of pleasure. For that, if it leads to pregnancy by chance, what to do, right? For that, contraceptive methods are available. There are short-term contraceptive methods available, right? For males, there are condoms which are available. For females, there are pills that are available. Contraceptive injections are available. Contraceptive rings are available. These are short-term contraceptive methods. There are also long-term contraceptive methods which are available for females, like the copper T coil, contraceptive implants, or the hormonal coils. Apart from that, the permanent contraceptive methods are also available. That is vasectomy for males. In vasectomy, the vas deferens is cut so that sperms are not released, and in females, the fallopian tubes are cut so that the egg is not released. These are permanent contraceptive methods. All right. So that's the basic idea of how organisms reproduce. Clear? Right. Thank you for watching this video. I hope this was insightful. And if you have liked this video, you can always follow me on this particular ID @Rahul Sai 222. Thank you for watching this again. Jai Hind.